The rain had been falling for 2 hours when Caleb Harper heard the knock. He had just turned off Sadie's lamp and was standing in the hallway when it came urgent, insistent, wrong for this hour. He opened the door. A woman stood on his porch in the downpour. One hand pressed flat against a stomach swollen with late pregnancy, her expensive coat drenched through. She was on every financial news channel he had ever passed. CEO. Pioneer. Cover story. Calm. Cover story. None of that was what stopped his breath. It was her eyes. He had known those eyes since he was 10 years old. What secret brought her back? And why, after all these years? Was he the very first person she came looking for? The night had started quietly. Caleb Harper had come home at 7:30 with grease under his fingernails and an invoice for a refrigeration unit he had repaired in a warehouse 20 miles north. He was 31 years old and had been doing this work since 19 HVAC repair, plumbing calls, electrical assessments for neighbors who trusted his hands more than they trusted city contractors. Honest work, modest pay, long hours. Most days that was enough. He lived with his daughter Sadie in a pale yellow house at the edge of a quiet town. The yard was small, the furniture plain, the kitchen carrying the smell of whatever he had cooked the night before. He knew his neighbors by name. The diner knew his order. He had made peace with the shape of his life. That evening, he had graded Sadie's spelling homework at the kitchen table, eaten leftover soup, and listened to the rain begin. Sadie fell asleep holding her stuffed rabbit. Caleb stood in her doorway for a moment, feeling the particular tenderness that single fathers carry quietly in their chests without ever knowing what to do with it. Then the knock came. He assumed a neighbor. Maybe Pastor Luke from down the road. He opened the door without turning on the porch light, and the figure on the other side was not anyone he had prepared for. She stood in the rain with her shoulders drawn in and her hair flat against her face. The coat she wore probably cost more than his truck. One hand gripped the porch railing, the other pressed against the swell of her stomach. Her face was pale and composed in the careful way of someone who has been composing themselves all day and has nothing left. Caleb stood in the doorway for 3 full seconds. He recognized Eleanor Pierce, the way you recognize a song you have not heard in 16 years, not by logic, but by something faster, something that lives in the body, the sharp line of her jaw, the way her brows drew together when she was frightened, the dark eyes that always held more than they gave away. She was 30 years old now. She ran a health technology company that had made the cover of 3 national magazines in the past year, and she was standing on his porch, soaking wet, looking at him like he was the last solid thing left in the world. Caleb. Her voice was lower than he remembered, rougher, barely above a whisper. I don't have anywhere else to go. He didn't move. Behind him, from down the hall, came the soft padding of small feet. Sadie appeared in the hallway light, blinking, one hand trailing along the wall. She looked at her father, then at the woman in the doorway, then at the woman's stomach. She reached out and found her father's hand. The rain fell. The 3 of them stood in the place where the past and present press against each other and neither wins. Caleb stepped aside and let her in. Eleanor's heels clicked twice on the hardwood. Then she stopped. She looked around the small living room, the patchwork throw on the couch, Sadie's crayon drawings taped to the wall, the reading lamp with the slightly bent shade, everything worn in the way of things that have been used steadily and cared for and never replaced for vanity. Nothing like any room she had inhabited in 10 years. Caleb brought a dish towel without ceremony. Eleanor's hands were trembling finely when she took it, the invisible trembling of someone who has been holding herself together by will alone and is now at its edge. Sadie crossed to the couch and sat very still, watching the stranger with eyes that took in everything. She was her father's daughter that way. Caleb filled the kettle and moved through the motions of tea-making with the deliberateness of a man who does not trust himself to speak yet. His heart behaved poorly. His hands were steady out of stubbornness. Your driver, he said, back turned. Your assistant. You have people who, I left without them, she said. He turned. She was sitting on the edge of the couch, with her wet coat folded over her arm, looking at the floor. On the television, a news headline drifted past. Speculation about Pierce Biotech's board dynamics, unnamed sources, internal pressure. Caleb looked at the screen. He looked back at her. He knew already that whatever had brought her here was not simple. Sadie got up without being asked, went to the hall closet, and came back with a thin blanket, which she laid across Eleanor's knees, with the gravity of a child performing something important. Eleanor looked at the little girl. Something in her face softened completely, not the diplomatic warmth she wore at press conferences, but something real and unguarded, like a door left open by accident. "Thank you," she said quietly. Sadie nodded once and climbed back to her end of the couch. Caleb brought the tea. When he set the mug on the table, he noticed something he had not seen in 16 years. On Eleanor's left wrist, half hidden under her blouse cuff, was a bracelet of braided blue thread, faded now, fraying at the knot. He had made it for her the summer they were 12. He had braided it from twine in his father's workshop. She had held her wrist out solemnly and let him tie it on. He had been trying not to think about her for 16 years. She had kept it. He did not know what to do with that. There is a kind of summer that belongs only to childhood and cannot be explained to anyone who was not there. Caleb Harper had lived one such summer at age 10, and every summer after it had been a little less vivid. Eleanor Pierce arrived at her grandmother's house on Millbrook Road every June, one suitcase. The formal posture of a girl raised to impress. But on Millbrook Road, there was no one to impress. There was only heat and long grass and the creak of a tire swing, and Caleb, the carpenter's son, who had already memorized every shortcut in the neighborhood. They became friends the way children do, when there is nothing to do but be together, first by proximity, then by genuine recognition. Eleanor was sharper than anyone he had ever known. She argued about things that mattered. She laughed loudly when something was actually funny. And she saw Caleb with a clarity that no one else in that town had ever bothered to apply to him. "You know more than you let on," she told him once. "In the fork of a maple tree. You just don't want people to know it." He had no answer. He had only shrugged and felt, obscurely, found out. They built things from scrap wood. They read paperbacks on the back porch when the heat made movement pointless. They raced bikes down the long hill on Crescent Street and walked them laboriously back up. They kept a running argument about which books were worth finishing and which deserved to be abandoned. And this argument was one of the great pleasures of those summers. The bracelet had been Caleb's idea. He had spent an afternoon in his father's workshop braiding blue twine around a bent nail to keep the tension right, unraveling it 3 times before he got it properly even. He had presented it to Eleanor with the casual indifference of a 12-year-old boy who does not yet know how to acknowledge that something matters to him, and she had held out her wrist with a solemnity that was exactly the right response. They made a promise under the maple tree, the kind that children make with complete sincerity, that neither distance nor money would change what they knew about each other. Then the summer Caleb was 14. Eleanor did not come back. He waited 2 weeks before allowing himself to feel it. When he did, it was worse than he expected. He wrote her a letter, got her address from the grandmother who gave it carefully. He wrote 3 more over the following months. No reply came. Eventually, he stopped writing and began the slow, grim work of teaching himself to want less. He was a man now who wanted very little. He had learned that skill thoroughly. He looked at Eleanor across the kitchen table, at the tired lines near her eyes, at the bracelet on her wrist, and felt a certainty shift beneath him. She had not left by choice. He did not yet know why he believed that. Only that he did. "I wrote to you," she said, when Sadie had gone to bed, and the rain was still heavy. "After I left. Many letters." Caleb went still. "I never received anything," he said. "I know." Her jaw tightened. "I figured that out later." He set his mug down slowly. The air in the kitchen changed. How much later? She looked at the table. Years. Too many. The ground shifted beneath the version of the past he had carried since he was 14. He had spent a very long time being angry at her, in the quiet, interior way of people who never shout. He had never entirely stopped. Now she was in his kitchen, wearing a bracelet she should have thrown away a decade ago, telling him there had been letters. The truth came out in pieces, the way truth does when someone has held it under pressure for a long time. Eleanor told him the company was being taken from the inside. Dominic Vale, her vice president and the man she had trusted as a partner, had spent months building a quiet architecture of misdirection communications sent in her name without her knowledge, documents circulated with signatures she had not given, board relationships cultivated to support a leadership transition she had never agreed to. Dominic was also the father of her child. She said this flatly, without dramatics, like someone stating a fact they have had to learn to separate from their pain. She had believed he was an ally, had believed it for almost 2 years, through long nights of work and the quiet accumulation of what she had mistaken for shared purpose. She had been wrong. As the company approached its largest acquisition announcement, he used her pregnancy as leverage, implying to the board that a single pregnant CEO was a liability, suggesting to her mother that a quiet marriage would solve everything cleanly. Her mother had agreed. Eleanor had refused. They had argued, in a way that left nothing standing. She had driven 2 hours without a destination before pulling off the highway and asking herself where she could actually go. Not a hotel Dominic would find her in an hour, not a friend everyone existed inside a world he could reach. She thought of Caleb. She had not let herself think of him in years. But the image of him came anyway. Steady and uncomplicated. From somewhere older than reason. "You are the only person I could think of," she said quietly, "who exists completely outside that world. The only one who wouldn't manage it, who wouldn't decide what was best for the company before they decided what was best for me." Caleb was quiet for a long time. Then he asked the question that had been sitting in him since she said his name at the door. "All those years," he said. "Why is it only now that you remembered I existed?" Caleb did not shout. He never shouted. But the quietness of the question was its own kind of weight. He told her what it had been like to wait. Not dramatically. Not asking for credit. But flatly. The way someone describes weather. The weeks of expecting a letter. The months of constructing reasons for her. The eventual, grinding work of closing off that part of himself so it could not hurt him further. He had been 14, then 15, then 16, and he had learned to think of her as a closed door. And that had been that. Eleanor listened without deflecting or apologizing too early. When he finished, she told him the rest. After she left, her mother had found Caleb's letters. Margaret Pierce had decided, with characteristic efficiency, that a working-class boy from a small town was not going to be threaded into her daughter's future. Every letter Eleanor sent from boarding school had been intercepted. When Eleanor discovered this at 17, finding Caleb's letters in her mother's desk while searching for something else, she had been old enough to be devastated but too young to know what to do. By the time she had the agency to act on it, she had convinced herself that Caleb had built a life without her, and she had no right to walk back in. She stopped speaking. The kitchen was quiet. Caleb looked at his hands. He looked at the faded bracelet on her wrist. He had carried 16 years of silence as abandonment. The silence had belonged to someone else the whole time. Then Eleanor, who had been managing her body's protests with the same composure she applied to everything, pressed one hand to her abdomen and went still in a way that was different from ordinary stillness. Her breath changed. Her face changed. Caleb was out of his chair before he consciously decided to move. The doctor's voice on the phone was carefully calibrated, not labor, likely stress-induced contractions, but her blood pressure was elevated, and she had not slept properly in 3 days. "Rest," he said. "Real rest." Caleb made up the guest room. Sadie appeared in the doorway in her pajamas, with her stuffed rabbit held at arm's length. "She can have Chester," Sadie said. "So she's not scared." Eleanor took the rabbit with both hands. Something in her throat moved. In the deep hours of the night, she woke from a dream she did not want, and found herself in the kitchen, in the dark. Caleb was already there, sitting with a glass of water and the day's mail, not reading it, just sitting the way people do when they are also not sleeping. He got up without speaking and poured her a glass of water. She sat across from him. They talked about small things in the way that 2 a.m. permits Sadie's stubbornness about bedtime, the first months of the pregnancy, when pretending had still seemed feasible. She looked at the row of Sadie's drawings on the refrigerator, at the chipped mug worn comfortable by use, at the whole quiet, insistent warmth of a house built for a child who was loved. "You became exactly who I thought you'd be," she said, almost to herself. He looked at her. "I'm a repairman," he said. "In a small town." "Yes," she said, and meant it entirely as a compliment. Then Eleanor's phone lit up on the counter. It lit again, and again. She turned the screen toward her. He watched her face become careful. She set the phone down. "He knows I'm here," she said. By 9 the next morning, 3 black vehicles with city plates had parked near the church. Caleb's neighbor knocked on the back fence to mention it. A man had been asking questions on the adjacent street. Eleanor stood at the kitchen window with cold tea and told Caleb she needed to leave. She said it quietly, with the tone of someone who has done the math and arrived at a conclusion they do not like. "If I stay, you become part of this," she said. "That's not fair. If you leave in this condition," Caleb said, "he picks you up in 10 minutes. I know, and you're in no position to fight anything from a moving target." He looked at her levelly. "He's not going to walk up my driveway and give orders. That's not going to happen." She stared at him with the expression of a person so accustomed to fighting alone that the presence of an ally feels almost suspect. Pastor Luke Bennett knocked at the back door, just then 72 years old. A face like a landscape. Eyes that had been listening to this town for decades. He had seen the cars. He had come because he knew the history of this house. He told them Margaret Pierce was also on her way 2 hours out, heading north. And then, before he left, he said something that stopped the morning cold. "There's a tin box in the storage room behind the church," he said. He was looking at Caleb. "I've been holding it a long time. I didn't know when the right moment was." He paused. "I think this might be it." Caleb looked at him. "Letters," Pastor Luke said simply. "Unopened." That afternoon, Caleb's phone rang. A city area code. The voice was pleasant and deliberate, the measured cadence of someone who practices being reasonable as a weapon. Dominic Vale said he appreciated Caleb's hospitality, that Eleanor could be difficult under stress, that it would be best if they handled things between adults. Caleb listened. Then he ended the call without responding. He stood in the hallway for a moment, then got his jacket and went to find Pastor Luke. The storage room behind the church smelled of dry wood and old paper. A metal box near the back wall. A rusted catch at the hinge. Inside, 11 envelopes. Eleanor's handwriting on everyone. Careful and looping in the way of a girl who still took penmanship seriously. Each addressed to Caleb Harper. Millbrook Road. None ever opened. None ever delivered. Pastor Luke explained, in his careful way, that he had come across them years ago and suspected Margaret's hand from the start, but without enough proof to act. He had held them because discarding them felt like completing a wrong that someone else had started. Caleb sat on a crate in that dusty room and read 11 letters from a 14-year-old girl. She wrote about leaving without understanding why, about crying into her pillow the first night so no one would hear, about trying not to believe he had simply moved on and finding that very hard, about stopping after the 6th letter, then writing 4 more. The last letter ended with one sentence: "No matter how far I go or how long this is, the summer you knew me is the truest I have ever been." He sat there a long time. The thin light through the storage room's single window moved as clouds shifted over the town. He had been carrying the weight of her absence as proof of something, proof that he had been naive to trust, naive to believe the promise under the maple tree, naive to think that what they had was the kind of thing that held. He had organized himself around the injury. He had become, in many ways, the man that injury had made him, careful, closed, good at providing for others, and bad at needing anything for himself. The injury had been real. The premise had been wrong the whole time. When he came back, Eleanor was at the kitchen table with Sadie, helping her with a drawing in blue crayon. They did not hear him come in. He stood in the doorway and looked at them. The small dark head bent over the paper, the woman beside her, pointing at something and smiling, and the 16 years between the past and the present contracted into something he could almost hold. He set the tin box on the table. Eleanor looked at it. Her face understood, before her mouth did. "I know I wasn't there," she said quietly, "even if it wasn't my choice. I know what that cost you." "I know you know," he said. Sadie put her crayon down and looked between the two adults with her patient, careful attention. Caleb looked at Eleanor for a long moment. "If you hadn't been cut off when you were 14, he said slowly, "would you be running now?" She was very quiet. "No," she said. "Probably not." He nodded once. "So let's not let it go further." They came on a Thursday morning with the thin veneer of civil concern. Dominic stepped out of the lead car in a coat that had never been questioned about its price. His lawyer appeared at his shoulder. Two men stood at the property edge, without quite setting foot on it, positioned in the careful way of people trained to be everywhere and visible. Margaret Pierce arrived separately in a smaller car that somehow conveyed greater authority. She looked at the house with the expression of someone assessing a problem. Caleb stood on the front steps with his arms at his sides, and his face set in the stillness of a man who has decided exactly what he will and will not do. Dominic came up the front path with a smile that did not involve his eyes. He spoke of concern, of delay, of the necessity of returning to the city for everyone's sake. He addressed Caleb as an afterthought, as a minor convenience to be navigated. Margaret stepped forward and said that she appreciated the hospitality, but that family matters needed to be handled among family. "She came to me," Caleb said. "That was all." Dominic began to explain the legal dimensions, the company's stability, Eleanor's responsibilities, the complications of the pregnancy, the things that would be said publicly if the situation was not resolved quickly. Then the screen door opened. Eleanor stepped onto the porch. She had changed her clothes. She stood straight. The exhaustion was still in her face, but it was no longer in the way she held herself. She looked at Dominic. She looked at her mother. And then she said the things she had spent 3 days finding the courage to say, not dramatically, not performing for an audience, but plainly, as a woman stating facts she is done being afraid of. She had never agreed to marry him. She had signed nothing under duress, and would contest every document obtained through coercion. She named 3 board members by name, and described their specific communications with Dominic regarding the plan to remove her from leadership. Her child would be raised by a mother who had chosen truth, and she would not apologize for that. Dominic began to speak of consequences. He described what a prolonged public dispute would do to a company already under scrutiny. He described what it would look like for a pregnant CEO to be found hiding in a working-class neighborhood, advised by people with no standing in the matter. He said these things with the smooth, habitual precision of a man who has built a career out of telling people what they stand to lose. Then he turned to Caleb and said that a man in Caleb's position should think carefully about which side of this he wanted to be associated with. Caleb looked at him evenly. "I'm going to ask you to leave my property," he said. The screen door opened again. Sadie came out in her school clothes, slightly too formal, because she had dressed for the occasion with great seriousness. She stood beside her father, looked at the man in the expensive coat, and said in the clear, carrying voice of a 7-year-old, who does not yet know to modulate for effect. If all these grown-ups are making her scared, can she just stay here with us instead? No one spoke. Dominic said nothing. Margaret Pierce looked at her daughter, and something moved across her face that was too complicated to name quickly. Eleanor's eyes filled. She did not look away. She said, "To all of them, I'll be at the board meeting Monday, with documentation and legal counsel and everything I need. But I will not be going back today as the person you've decided I should be." She breathed. "I'm going back as myself." Dominic left. His men left. Margaret Pierce lingered on the front path, looking at her daughter with an expression that was, for the first time, something other than tactical. Then she got into her car and drove away. The yard went quiet. Sadie slipped her hand into her father's. The board meeting was 5 days away. Eleanor had the documentation. What she needed was the architecture. To present it in a way that could not be dismissed by men, very good at dismissal. Caleb was not a lawyer, but he knew one. Ruth Caldwell had grown up in the county, ran a small corporate dispute practice, and answered his call on the first ring. She came that evening and sat at the kitchen table with Eleanor for 3 hours, going through every document, the emails, the unsigned board resolutions, the communications between Dominic and the 3 compromised members. Ruth laid it out in the flat, useful language of someone who has seen this structure before and knows exactly where it can be dismantled. When Ruth left at 10 o'clock, she had a plan and a folder of photocopied documents. Eleanor sat in the quiet afterward and looked at nothing. Caleb sat across from her. "You're going to be okay," he said. "How do you know?" "Because you've been okay through worse," he said. "You just weren't doing it from the right foundation." They stayed at the table talking past midnight, not about documents or strategy at first, but about the years between them. He told her he had been so angry at her absence that he had stopped letting himself want things fully, had funneled everything into Sadie, and the work and the ordered, manageable life of a man who does not risk anymore. She told him that every achievement had felt like a room built inside a cage someone else had designed, that she had learned to call that feeling ambition, and had spent a decade mistaking control for freedom. They did not rush toward anything, but the thing between them became very clear. Sadie appeared in the doorway in her pajamas. "Are you coming back after?" she asked Eleanor. "After all the city stuff?" Eleanor looked at the child. She did not deflect or promise anything she could not guarantee. "I want to," she said. "I'm going to try to become someone worth coming back to." Sadie found this satisfactory and went back to bed. Caleb looked at Eleanor across the table. "I'm driving you Monday," he said. "Sadie stays with Ruth. I'll get you there." She looked at him for a long moment. "You already decided," she said. "Yes," he said. They left at 6 in the morning. The town was still gray as the truck pulled out. Eleanor sat with her hands in her lap and watched the streetlights thin out and the highway open ahead. She rested one hand on her stomach. The baby moved a slow, rolling shift she had stopped being startled by but never stopped noticing. She looked at Caleb's profile as he drove. The unhurried attention he gave the road. "I'm not scared," she said. The words carried a note of mild discovery. He glanced at her. "Of the meeting? Of any of it," she said. "Today," he nodded, eyes back on the road. The boardroom occupied a full floor of a building in the financial district. Glass and height and expensive silence arranged as argument. Eleanor had stood in that room dozens of times. She had never walked into it the way she walked in that morning. Caleb did not go in. He sat in the lobby on a bench near a potted plant. Jacket folded on his knee, phone in his pocket, in the patient stillness of a man who has found exactly where he needs to be. Not performing anything, simply present. Load-bearing. Eleanor walked in at 9 with Ruth at her side and a folder in her hand. Dominic was already seated. 3 board members sat in the careful posture of people deciding how much they already knew. 2 others, the ones Eleanor had spoken to privately over the weekend, watched the door with focused readiness. She sat down. She did not smile. She did not perform composure. She opened the folder. She laid out the email chain between Dominic and board member Gerald Marsh, in which the phrase "managing the liability" referred explicitly to her pregnancy. She presented the circulated contract amendment, the signatures of which Ruth had documented as legally insufficient. She presented 4 months of Dominic's internal communications, his own words, his own formatting, telling the complete story of a man building something on land that had never been his. Dominic spoke twice. Both times Eleanor answered with the next document in the sequence. By 11 o'clock the room had changed. By 11:30 Gerald Marsh had asked to speak with Ruth privately. By noon Dominic was conferring urgently with his own attorney, who had arrived that morning not knowing he would be leaving under very different circumstances. It was not a dramatic collapse. It was the quiet, methodical kind that happens when something has been built on false foundations, and someone finally arrives with the original survey. Eleanor came through the lobby doors at 1 in the afternoon. Caleb stood. He took in her face and asked nothing. She said, "It's done." He looked at her carefully, not for performance, but for the actual thing underneath. She was genuinely and completely exhausted. The precision and the will had been spent, and there was only the exhaustion left, and it was the exhaustion of someone who has done something real. He moved toward her, and she leaned, briefly and entirely, against his shoulder. He began to say something important. She said his name. At a different pitch. She was in labor. The hospital was 7 minutes away. They made it in 5. Caleb sat in the waiting room, with his hands clasped between his knees, and the featureless quality of time that hospital waiting rooms create every minute, both very long and entirely without content. He thought about 11 letters in a tin box, a bracelet made of twine, a 7-year-old asking if the woman at the door could stay. He thought about the fact that for 16 years he had organized himself around a belief that had been false from the beginning, and the truth had been sitting in a church storage room the whole time, patient as old paper. He was going to need more than a waiting room chair to sort through all of it, but the cold, careful, self-protective thing that had lived in his chest since he was 14 had stopped feeling like a fixed part of him. Clara was born at 4:52 in the afternoon. 6 pounds, 14 ounces. She announced herself immediately and loudly, which the nurse said was a very good sign. Dominic Vale's departure from Pierce Biotech's governance was completed within 3 weeks. His attorney, having reviewed the evidentiary record, had advised firmly against contesting anything. He retained his minimal equity stake and removed himself from Eleanor's life with the efficiency of a man who has been left very few alternatives. Margaret Pierce did not disappear. She was not that kind of woman. But she had driven home from Millbrook Road in a silence that lasted a week, and when she finally called her daughter, she led, not with strategy but with, "How are you feeling? How much does she weigh? Can I come when you're ready for visitors?" Eleanor said yes. A small yes. The beginning of a different arrangement than the one they had always operated under. Eleanor was 30 years old and harbored no illusions that her mother would transform entirely, but she had seen something shift in Margaret's face when a 7-year-old's honest question had made the air go still, and she believed that shift was real. 6 weeks after Clara was born, on a Wednesday afternoon in autumn, Eleanor came back to the yellow house on Millbrook Road. She drove herself. Clara in the car seat, a bag for 3 days, no security detail, no publicist, no schedule beyond the next several hours. She parked on the street and sat for a moment with her hands in her lap. The house looked exactly as it had on the night she first came. The front light on even in the afternoon. A raked yard. New crayon drawings in the window. The door opened. Caleb came onto the porch. He looked at her car. Then at her standing beside it. Then at the bundle. She was carefully lifting from the car seat. His expression did the thing that expressions do when a person has been waiting for something, has told himself he has not been waiting. And the thing arrives anyway. Sadie came through the door behind him at speed, already talking, already curious about the baby, already moving through the world with the cheerful confidence of a child who expects it to be good. Eleanor stood on the front path holding Clara and looked at Caleb on the porch steps. "I don't know how fast or slow this should go," she said. "I don't know how to promise things from a distance yet. But I know I don't want to keep living like I'm one decision away from running." She paused. "I want to start from the truth. With you, if that's still something." Caleb came down the steps. He stood in front of her and looked at her face, the face he had known since she was 10 years old, which had occupied some permanent room in who he was, even through all the years they were not speaking. He looked at the baby in her arms, asleep, entirely unaware of the weight of the moment she was sleeping through. "There's no one left to intercept anything," he said. He said it quietly, as if it were simply a fact about the world. Which it was. No one left to hold letters. No one left to cut the thread. "So stay," he said. Sadie had already reached Eleanor's side, and was peering at Clara with the solemn reverence she reserved for things she had decided were important. The afternoon light fell long and amber across the yard. The maple at the property edge had gone to gold. Somewhere down the street a door opened and closed, with the ordinary domestic sound of a neighbor arriving home. The town made its ordinary sounds around them indifferent, familiar, unhurried, as it always had and presumably always would. The door that had opened in a night of rain to receive a woman who was running had not, in the end, been a door of rescue. It had been something older and more necessary than that. It had been a door of recognition, the kind that requires both people to walk through it, that leads not to safety as an absence of danger, but to safety as the presence of something real and true, and finally, after a very long time, returned to. They went inside.